And of course, I'd just been working on a play of Oscar Wilde at that time. And Oscar had this very striking and notable brother, just 18 months or so older than he was, Willie Wilde. And it was sort of intriguing, though, in sort of building up the picture of Oscar's childhood, to realise that as he was growing up as a schoolboy and a young man, his brother was really considered to be as brilliant as he was, and as charming, as funny, as eloquent. And indeed, there was much debate amongst friends and family as to which of the two of them was the most brilliant. So I thought, yes, I mean, he would clearly be a very intriguing figure to draw out more. And certainly while I was researching Oscar, I was sort of aware of the evidence that or intriguing information about Willie I sort of swept up as I went along. So it was, yes, as well, a way of reaping a final harvest on all the research I'd done into the period.
Hello, I'm Zeb Links, editor at Aspects of History. My esteemed younger sister ended up with better A-levels than me and secured a first to my 2-1. It stung. Honestly, it still does. But what if I had a sibling as brilliant as Oscar Wilde? This week's episode offers a vivid window through which to view the artistic, literary, and theatrical world of late Victorian London, a period of remarkable creativity, dramatic falls, and cultural change. But instead of viewing this fin de siècle moment through the brightest lights, why should we not focus on the forgotten characters? This week on the Aspects of History podcast, acclaimed biographer Matthew Sturgis discusses relative failures, his exploration of 3 overlooked figures who lived in the shadow of their more famous siblings: Willie Wilde, brother of Oscar Wilde, Mabel Beardsley, sister of Aubrey Beardsley, and Howard Sturgis, younger brother of the novelist Julian Sturgis. Coming up next week on the pod, the Aspects of History luminaries and I sit down to discuss our favourite reads of the last 12 months, the definitive guide to what you should be bringing in your hand luggage on holiday. Don't miss our Summer Reads episode or indeed our author's choices on the website. But for now, settle in and enjoy my discussion with Matthew Sturgis. Welcome, Matthew, to the Aspects of History podcast. Great to have you on.
Well, it's very lovely to be here. Thank you, Zeb.
So we're here to chat about your new book, Relative Failures, The Lives of Willie Wilde, Mabel Beardsley, and Howard Sturgis, which was released a few weeks ago by Head of Zeus. Very novel concept of retelling the lives of the lesser-known siblings of 3 noted figures in London at the end of the 19th century and into the 20th. You better talk us through how this subject and the sibling relationships kind of came about and what you expected that would reveal before writing the book.
Well, it came out of my researches into the characters of this period more generally, in that I've written biographies of some of the major figures of the period, Aubrey Beardsley, Walter Sickert, and, of course, Oscar Wilde, who stood at the very heart of that fin de siècle moment. And during my sort of researches into those characters, I of course, became aware, of the whole milieu, but also of their particular friends and relatives. And so the starting point for this book was going to a wonderful Aubrey Beardsley exhibition that was put on at Tate Britain, tragically, just in the spring of 2020. And it opened a week before the sort of lockdown kicked in. But happily, I was so keen to go and see it that I went on the opening day or days, and going round it with a friend and my wife, they were struck not only by Beardsley's work, but there was a room with pictures of some of his contemporaries, and there was a wonderful portrait by Oswald Burley of this very striking woman with a great mane of red hair and a hawk on her wrist, dressed as a Elizabethan page boy. And they said, "Who's that?" And I explained that it was Aubrey's sister, Mabel. And they said, "Well, gosh, I mean, she looks extraordinary. Tell us more about her. And I've sort of summoned up some memory of from my researches into Aubrey, but I thought, there was a scope to go further and to explore her life more, and but that perhaps there wasn't quite enough around her, both in the surviving record, and also really, I suppose, in her place in the world to merit a full biography. And so the idea of gathering in some other figures, other siblings of more famous brothers, crept in. And of course, I'd just been working on a new biography of Oscar Wilde at that time, and Oscar had this very striking and notable brother, just 18 months or so older than he was, Willie Wilde. And it was sort of intriguing, though, in sort of building up the picture of Oscar's childhood, to realize that as he was growing up as a schoolboy and a young man, his brother was really considered to be as brilliant as he was, and as charming, as funny, as eloquent. And indeed, there was much debate amongst friends and family as to which of the two of them was the most brilliant. And so I thought, yes, I mean, he would clearly be a very intriguing figure to draw out more. And certainly while I was researching Oscar, I was sort of aware of the evidence that or intriguing information about Willie I sort of swept up as I went along. So it was, yes, as well, a way of reaping a final harvest on all the research I'd done into the period.
And
Ooh.
your final figure?
The rule of three sort of dictates that for one of these projects you need three people, and I'd wondered about doing Herbert Beerbohm Tree, perhaps, Max Beerbohm's half-brother, a great theatrical impresario, or the son rather than the brother of Henry Irving or whatever. But then in my own family background, I've long been conscious of these two literary great uncles, the brothers of my great grandfather, Howard and Julian Sturgis. And I mean, now they're sort of largely, well, not entirely forgotten to history, but in the 1890s, they both had a profile as literary cultural figures. Julian particularly, who wrote a succession of popular novels, and had a sort of moment of really particular prominence in 1892 when he contributed the libretto to Arthur Sullivan's one serious grand opera, an adaptation of Walter Scott's Ivanhoe. And Sullivan, of course, of Gilbert and Sullivan, had this hugely successful career writing comic operas with W.S. Gilbert, and these were produced by the great impresario of the day, Richard D'Oyley Carte. And Sullivan, a great musician, had this vision to write a grand opera, but D'Oyley Carte kept putting him off and saying, Arthur, absolutely, we're going to do it, but Gilbert's just come up with a marvelous story set in Japan or whatever, and we should do that. But finally, at the beginning of the 90s, he relented and said, "Okay, Arthur, you're on," and they realized that, of course, they couldn't get Gilbert to write the libretto for the piece because, Gilbert couldn't be serious, but also any audience would expect it to be a comic opera. And so, in fact, it was Gilbert who suggested this young novelist who'd actually written a libretto for another English opera as well, might be the chap for the job. And so Julian Sturgis took up the task, and indeed, Sturgis and Sullivan's Ivanhoe opened at the beginning of 1892 and was a huge success. Was wonderfully reviewed, played to full houses to begin with, and was the success that both Sullivan and D'Oyly Carte and Julian had hoped for. And then it sort of slightly, there was a sort of unfortunate coda in that the D'Oyly Carte had hoped to had commissioned various other British composers to produce other grand operas, which were supposed to come on and play in repertory with Ivanhoe, and they failed to meet the deadlines, and the operas weren't there to be performed, and so Ivanhoe had to run on at this new theatre that D'Oyly Carte had built, the glorious theatre that stands on Cambridge Circus still. Really through the year to sort of gradually dwindling audiences. And so it sort of began with a bang and ended with a whimper, and really has never been put on since, which I think is not a reflection on the music, but more, it has a sort of huge cast, and I think somebody has to come on stage on a horse and things like that. So there are reasons why producers might shy away from reviving it, but there is a recording that I sometimes listen to while doing the ironing, which is good. It's good. But Julian's brother Howard, also a writer, a younger brother, felt very much in the shadow of his older brother, but had literary ambitions and really poured a decade of his life into writing a novel. Bell Chamber, a wonderful satire of upper class life in the 1890s, and when it came out on the sort of eve of publication, he sent it to his great friend Henry James, rather older than himself, but Howard and Julian were essentially Anglo-Americans. Julian was born in America, Howard actually in England, but their father was American, but had settled in England to become a partner in Barings Bank. And James and indeed Edith Wharton were very much part of that sort of Anglo-American world. And Howard hugely admired James and sent him the proofs of his book, and was really devastated when Henry James, sort of wrote back, thanking him for showing him the proofs and saying, it all seems very good, but the beginning doesn't really work, and the middle drags, and of course the ending, you'll agree, is unsatisfactory. And poor Howard, thought, oh my goodness, what if I produce? Should I sort of ring up the publishers at once and tell them to withdraw it? And Henry James rather disingenuously said, oh no, I can't believe you're thinking like that. No, I'm sure nobody else will mind at all. All these errors in the book. But as Edith Wharton pointed out to Howard, how mad of you to send your book to dear Henry. We all love him, but unfortunately, he's a genius, so he can really only see things as he would do them. I mean, he's not a sort of perceptive critic in the more conventional sense. And don't worry at all about him. And the book is brilliant. And indeed, the book came out, and it was quite nicely reviewed, but it didn't set the world alight. And I thought it'd been a huge amount of very hard work, and all his friends hadn't liked it. And so he would retire pretty much from the literary fray and return to his first love, which was embroidery. And he, as the youngest in the family, he'd been brought up very much in his mother's boudoir, and and as a child, he'd learnt needlework, and he loved it. And he said, as he didn't smoke, he thought it was very good to have something to do with your hands. So, yes, I mean, his last decades were spent sitting around doing embroidery and entertaining his friends. He was a very brilliant host and a very charming person. And so in the record of the period, there are wonderful descriptions of him, but rarely describing the splendid tea parties he put on.
I mean, already just talking to you, the kind of bohemian creative scene of London at this period, I mean, that is almost a character of the book itself, this bustling place as the 19th century wanes and the Victorian shackles lift. this is kind of, I think I saw one reviewer call you a native of this kind of fin de siècle period, or the parties, the artistic endeavor, the theatrical galleries, literary events. What is it that keeps you coming back to the late Victorian, early Edwardian period, and how long does that association you have with it go back?
Well, it's been, yes, a long sort of love affair or whatever. I mean, I do find it a very, I mean, a richly intriguing period, but also a heartening one in a way that it's a sort of period when those, some of the Victorian certainties were beginning to crumble. People were trying to find new ways of engaging with the world, and artistically, it was, yes, a time of experiment and daring, and then, of course, and I suppose, and optimism. I mean, there was optimism about the possibility of what art could achieve and the importance that art had in the world, which, that are ideas which I find both interesting and attractive. And then, of course, it has the drama in that that sort of moment of expansion and experiment and daring was then suddenly arrested by the great cataclysm of the Oscar Wilde scandal, which conveniently takes place in the middle of the decade of the 1890s in 1895. And Wilde, who had been, the great embodiment of this, aesthetic, artistic innovation, movement of innovation, then became the sort of focus for its repression. There was a feeling that, his disgrace and his, crimes, as they were then thought of, were the result of this artistic daring and expression, and as a result, there must be a sort of reaction against it, and of course, people struggled on against that that tide of reaction, but it, yes, it creates a dynamic and drama in the story of that of the period, which sort of remains compelling.
Hello, Zeb here. Please forgive my interruption, but I wanted to let you know that at Aspects of History, we produce a digital magazine featuring articles, interviews, short stories, and book reviews of the best historical writing available. Authors featured including Ben Macintyre, Lucy Worsley, Andrew Roberts, and plenty more. An annual subscription is available for only $9.99. That's pounds or dollars. Yep, you heard that right. That's 6 issues for under £10 or dollars. Head over to aspectsofhistory.com to subscribe, where you can also gift subscriptions. Now back to the show.
What was interesting about following 3 minor figures is that it sort of was a way of exploring how that cultural world sort of reached beyond, the mere fact of these great writers or artists creating their well-known works. I mean, Willie Wilde, Oscar's brother, got drawn into the world of journalism, print journalism, which was hugely important. It was a great sort of field of expansion in that late 19th century period, and had a huge influence on the way that art developed. One has to remember that Aubrey Beardsley, every drawing that he created was published was really produced for publication and was published in a magazine or a book, and just the sense of that sort of burgeoning press world, and the opportunities that it offered, and the need that it had for personalities to promote. There was a sort of understanding that facts weren't sort of quite enough to engage a public, and they would be intrigued by personality and by gossip and narrative. That's something that comes vividly out of following Willie Wilde's story. And then with Mabel Beardsley, I mean, she wrote for the papers herself, but then she also had a career as a minor actress. And that way that the stage dominated the cultural life of London, in an age before television, the internet, everything else, it was the theatre that people went to. It was the show. It was the communal cultural activity. People went to the same place. They could discuss the same place, and just to realise how deep that went and how broad it was. We remember the plays of the period that have survived in the repertoire. The works of Wilde, of Shaw, of maybe Pinero just. But by following Mabel, one was able to build up a much bigger understanding of that whole world of the London stage.
And I mean, you've mentioned those titles in your back catalogue. The two biographies of Beardsley and the Oscar triumph, as everybody acknowledged. Was it a challenge to kind of clear your head of kind of preconceptions? I imagine you were, as intimate as anybody with those two lives, and then viewing them from the lens of their sibling relationships. Was that quite a strange, refreshing look at things?
So yes, I mean, it was nice to as it were, step aside and take the sidelight onto the scene, and of course, yes, I mean the famous sibling, Oscar or Aubrey or whatever, they remain a part of the story. I mean, they are a sort of a key element in the tale of their less successful siblings, but. It was a very refreshing way to sort of take up a familiar subject and just set it in a different light. And I think, as you read the book, there is the entertainment of an interest in coming to know Willie and Mabel and Howard, but you certainly also build up you enrich your sense of Oscar and Aubrey, and if you've ever heard of him, Julian Sturgis, sort of in the process. So I think, yes, I mean, I think it's actually a very useful way of looking at or re-looking at figures.
And that art of writing a biography more generally, I've got a few questions. What exactly is it that draws you to the format, and how constant is the process of building and refining these personal accounts? Does it make it a tougher assignment if the subject is more obscure, or was that kind of more liberating?
So yes, I mean, it was a major. I mean, that sense was a major shift. I mean, in that Oscar obviously is a hugely well-known figure and a figure who had been much, biographied. And there, yes, there was the challenge of taking on everything that existed already, and then but recognizing that, in fact, when I wrote my book, there hadn't actually been a new biography of Oscar for almost 30 years. And inevitably, in that period, an enormous amount of interesting new information had come to light, and which needed to be integrated into the record. And then also, I think, just the way that previous biographies had been written. I mean, the wonderful biography of of Oscar that had been written by Richard Ellman in the 80s was, I mean, I suppose very much a literary biography, and has great virtues in that. Ellman was a great literary critic, and steeped in that world, and he builds a vivid sense of Oscar's literary life. But by leaning into that, it becomes less and less a historical biography, and indeed, for various reasons, it's not entirely accurate historically, and often inaccurate. And so I wanted to try and return Wilde to, or give an account of Wilde's life that was historical, that didn't prefigure everything, that didn't sort of begin with the assumption that he was going to turn into Oscar Wilde, or indeed was Oscar, the great character of that we know in our mind, of this eloquent dandy parading through his life, writing one masterpiece after another. Because if you follow his life as he lived it, he was unaware, of course, that things were going to turn out as they did, and he, that sort of sense of, I don't know, contingency, or whatever you want to call it, I think gives a sort of richer understanding of how he came to achieve what he did, and to do what he did. Of course, none of that applied to writing about Willie or Mabel, who these entirely or largely unnamed people who had to be retrieved from the record. And I suppose one of the really wonderful things about writing a biography of late 19th century figures, which has come into being really over the last decade or so, is this amazing project to digitize the historic newspaper archives. Previously, of course, it was almost impossible to retrieve information from old newspapers. You could go up to the National Newspaper Archive in Colindale and sort of search around on microfilms and microfiche, even worse, to try and track down some reference. But essentially, unless you knew where the reference might be, you couldn't find it. But now, with the World Wide Web and the digitization of the archives, you can put in your search terms, put the name of Willie Wilde or whatever in double inverted commas, and send it off, and come back with dozens of references and new references, and I'd say that has been incredibly sort of rich and rewarding, and really allowed these books to be written with the sort of texture and richness that I hope they have.
I had a kind of final question, and why you took the choice, as is your authorial right, to not kind of tie the three lives together. I don't know, was there ever an intention to kind of draw the strands together and to timestamp the era, or was that kind of unnecessarily clamping three quite different personalities together?
Yes, I mean, I like the idea of the disparate figures in a common world. I mean, I think, and when I sort of began the project and sort of started sort of assembling my sources and resources, I did wonder whether there would be a moment I was ever able to get them all together in the same room. And I can't quite do that, but their lives certainly intermeshed, and although they, because each is distinct, in my telling of uh, of their biographies. I think if you sort of, as you read through them, you sense the moments where their worlds touch and collide. I mean, in the account of each of the figures, there is the moment in 1895 when they have to confront the drama of the Wilde trial, and so that perhaps acts as a sort of unifying moment. I can't. I think it's sort of Jim Jarmusch film where there are sort of three separate episodes, and there's a gunshot that rings out in each of the sections, which sort of alerts you to the fact that they're all taking part at the same in the same place at the same time, and you just hear that gunshot at three different moments. So maybe that was an inspiration in the in the structure of the book.
Very good. And what's on the cards now? Any particular figure in your sights or potential titles in mind?
Well, I've been extending the moment of demob euphoria for perhaps rather longer than I should have done in terms of taking on a new project. But one of the nice things about writing a book, and particularly a biographical book, is there's often a certain amount of related endeavour that sort of follows after it. And I'm in discussions at the moment with a lovely, rather quixotic publisher, Pallas Athena Books, who is interested in the idea of bringing out a collection of Howard Sturgis's short stories. I mean, he'd published 2 during his lifetime, and then I've come into possession of some other unpublished ones, and they are, yes, of interest. I mean, one of the unpublished ones relates to his relationship with Henry James, and so that has a particular point and interest. So I'm convincing myself that I'm hard at work preparing that.
Very good. Well, Matthew, we're running out of time, but thanks so much for coming on and chatting and talking us through what is a fascinating era of brilliant, curious people, and you do it so vividly. Relative Failures, The Lives of Willie Wilde, Mabel Beardsley, and Howard Sturgis is published in hardback by Apollo. We'll put the links in the description, so do have a look, listener. Great to have you on, Matthew. Hope to catch up soon.
Thank you very much.
Thanks so much for listening. Links are in the show notes. Please share with friends and family and keep your eyes peeled for new episodes. And if you want to get in touch, you can through X or email history@aspectsofhistory.com. But until then, thank you and good night.
When maintaining your daily wellness rituals is important to you, the change in routine during the summer can feel daunting. Kachava's new travel packs help you stick to your daily ritual, even when you're on the go. Just one packet of Kachava's all-in-one nutrition shake provides complete nutrition with 25 grams of protein, 6 grams of fiber, greens, adaptogens, and much more. So you'll be fueled and ready for wherever life or your summer adventures take you. No fillers, no nonsense. Just the good stuff your body craves. Plus, it actually tastes delicious. But you can try it for yourself because the variety pack includes all 6 delicious fan favorites: chocolate, vanilla, chai, matcha, coconut acai, and strawberry. So instead of worrying about sticking to your daily ritual, simplify it with Kachava. Go to Kachava.com and use code NEWS for 15% off. That's KACHAVA.com, code NEWS.